there's not a lot of female representation or women that work in the game, particularly in men's football. I'd seen his Facebook post the couple of weeks leading up to, and I genuinely, even as somebody who works in this, would have never known that anything was wrong. And I mean this from all aspects. I don't think football's diverse enough. I don't think football's diverse enough at all.
So, Abby, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Excited to be here. Love a chat. Love a chin wag.
Why is player care important?
I think player care is fundamentally important because we need to always remember that we're still working with human beings. That has to come first and foremost for me. So whatever we're doing with an athlete or wherever we're working, if we're working with people, we have to look after the person first. And I think that's probably not always been done in elite sport, particularly not in football. So I think, if players aren't thriving as humans first and foremost, then they won't be able to sort of thrive to the best of their ability in the sport environment either. So yeah, I would say that's probably why it's important.
You said then it's been ignored within football. Why do you think that is?
I don't know if the word's probably ignored. I think it's probably a case of, because of the focus of football, it's so performance driven and it's always been a traditionally hyper masculine environment. I think it's probably just happened quite naturally. We've not ignored it, but we've not thought about it. So I think, it's probably just a case of something that was neglected before, but has now received a little bit more of a high profile now that players have come out, more recently about issues that they've faced, particularly regarding mental health stuff or addiction and struggles that they've gone through throughout their career. So I think, maybe not ignored, maybe just not acknowledged, I would probably say.
Is there anything that stands out as a consistent theme through your experiences?
I think specifically, if we're talking about actually delivering player care, I would probably say things like costs. So obviously player care was relatively new. It was only introduced to clubs in 2019 officially. Obviously there was probably people within roles before then, kind of ad hoc, that did, mental health support things if clubs had psychologists or psychiatrists that work alongside. But player care was obviously brought in quite recently. So up until recently, it wasn't actually funded. So the club was having to basically fund that position out of their own money, whereas now they do receive funding for that position. So I think probably maybe not as much now, but when I first started, there was definitely a cost implement to that for clubs. And especially when there's such there's so much discrepancy between clubs. So, if you're at Chelsea or Man United, you might have a lot more money to put a player care department together than if you are at Exeter or Tranmere, for example. I'm not outing any of those clubs, by the way. They might have excellent player care departments. But, it's along those lines of, if it wasn't kind of necessary to have and it wasn't an audit point, or it wasn't, a requirement, I don't think clubs were really invested in it. Now, obviously, they have the money to do it. I know that clubs are fiddling around with that money, trying to make sure that, maybe other areas where they need a little bit more funding, kind of some of that funding's going to it, which it's not supposed to do. But hopefully we see, a little bit more less of a cost problem moving forward. I think another big one, probably the main challenge I've ever faced, is buy-in. So not just from the club itself, but then for the people that make up your team and the people that you work around with as a multidisciplinary team. So does the coaching department value player care? Do the sports science team value or know how to work with player care? Things like that. Do management buy in? Are you sitting on, the key meetings and things that you need to be in to promote and to provide the best player care support? So I think that's been probably a big one for me. And then I think finally, probably another thing is, as I said earlier, those discrepancies between and differences between the clubs is, one, because there's a lack of a definition of player care. Some clubs are doing things very, very differently to others. Now, that's not to say what's right and what's wrong, because I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer. I think provided that you're probably ticking certain boxes and you're providing support for players, then it can be player care. I think there probably just needs to be more academic work done on, and work with the Premier League and the EFL to actually say, this is what player care is within the clubs. This is what it should look like.
Why is that the case then? Is that because it's a growing area? It's an area that is hard to... You mentioned that word clarity. I think that was a very key word in terms of clarifying the roles and responsibilities of player care and also the importance of it. Why is there a little bit of a animosity with understanding what it is and justifying its value within the discipline of football?
I think, like you just said there, it's definitely, I think a large part of that is played by the infancy of it. So I don't think I think everyone probably sat at the Premier League meeting and went, yeah, let's put together this thing called player care, and then went, yeah, cool, roll it out, and then probably didn't realise how much it was going to take off, and went, oh, actually, we've probably not given enough information here on what it should be and what it should look like. And I'm not saying that stuff, you don't go into everything knowing that that's what it's going to look like or that's what it's going to be, and it does organically develop as it goes along, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I just think at this point, 4 years in, have we built on that clarity? I'm not sure. I think there's some really good stuff that has started to be rolled out, but that's only been within the last year or so. I think before that, and I only speak on behalf of myself here, but I obviously speak to a lot of other player care professionals, we kind of felt like we'd been chucked in the deep end, like with no armbands at one point. It was kind of like, here's your 8 audit points, crack on, kind of thing. And I think there was no training available, so there's no specific Premier League qualification or EFL qualification for player care. Nobody already worked in the organisation doing player care, so nobody was there to train you hands-on what to do. And obviously there's things that have come about now regarding player care qualifications, but the only one that I know of, which is actually certified to get you, accreditation, is the UCFB and GIS partnership player care course, which obviously we've briefly discussed previously, is a fantastic course.
I spoke to Dr. Richard Elliott last week, and he mentioned that he's fearful that player care is going to be glamorized and kind of seen as this term that is good to throw about, but there's no underpinning of the area and its usefulness and best practice, etc. You mentioned, limited CPD. I presume maybe communities of practice and sharing best methods can be a challenge at this current point. Do you agree with that point around?
Entirely agree, and I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I've spoken to Richard. We've covered the topic quite a bit. I think there is, a fear that it might become a little bit glamorized. I hear people talk about player care sometimes, specifically when you speak to people outside of football who want to get into football or want to know more about your role. So I'll, have a random conversation with someone who, you meet in a function or whatever and say, oh, what do you do? And you say player care. And they automatically think that you do that liaison role of, oh, so you sort their home out when they move over. No, actually, I don't do any of that. Or you put their child into school. Well, no, we have a liaison officer for that. I actually look after them more from a, personal development and mental well-being point of view, making sure that they're almost holistically balanced. And yeah, there's that tendency to, I mean, I don't know if you saw, Christie, the Liverpool job that came out, which was player care for the first team. And I think it was one of the only few clubs that actually title it player care at first team level. And I read the job description and I was thinking, and it was saying, you'll work with the highly talented first team players, and you'll do this for them and wash their car for them, and you'll find things to do this. And I was thinking that is kind of, one, it's not really what we would class as player care, but secondly, you know, it was just over glamorizing a job that, you know, on a daily basis isn't going to look like you're going and picking up, you know, Ferraris and stuff like that. That's not necessarily what it looks like. And I thought that was quite funny to see how people are now going to perceive player care based on that sort of job description that had gone out. And obviously a lot of people are going to look at it. They might not apply, but loads of people will look and think, oh, I wonder what that's about. And it's, you know, first title is you'll be working with the, you know, elite, or, you know, these elite stars or whatever. And I think even the Daily Mail picked up the sort of language used.
I think just in general within society, we're trying to change the perception around mental health and understand the value of psychology and developing ideas around support, etc. I can imagine seeing that advert is quite demoralizing, considering you're trying to push this new method of support and care and change people's perceptions on its value, etc. And then you see that and it's a little bit like, well, like that is demoralizing.
Yeah You're thinking, I work, you know, 10-12 hour days for somebody to write in the paper that all I do is wipe players' asses for them all day. Great, perfect. I'm super glad that's what people are going to think now when I tell them that I'm, you know, head of player care for a football club. I think it's, and I'm not, you know, afraid to admit that when I saw the Daily Mail article, I was almost a Twitter keyboard warrior. You know, I was like, no, I'm not having it. And then I was thinking, no, this is exactly what they want you to do. And I, you know, if I was from the outside in giving myself the advice, I'd be telling the players, guys, just leave it, you know, just ignore it, you know, whatever. But it hit a little bit of a sore spot, I think, for me. But I was just in the end like, do you know what? They haven't asked any of us for comment, so it's not really a fairly written article. So it is what it is.
What are some of the signs that maybe an athlete or a player or someone at your football club, or maybe someone at another football club, it might even be within society in general, where they might be struggling with emotional aspects or mental aspects? What kind of things do you pick up on within your role?
I think had I not done the job that I've done for the past 4 years, my answer would probably be very different. I think it's important to note that the more you do a job like mine, or you work in, you know, mental health and well-being, there is actually no kind of, oh, if a player does this or a person does this, then that's, you know, how they're feeling. I think it comes back to that there is no one size kind of fits all. You know, for one person who's struggling, they might show typical signs, so like anger, outbursts, showing a lot of emotion where usually they probably wouldn't. And then on the other hand, you might have a person that's struggling and actually completely isolates from the group and withdraws. So that's opposite ends of the spectrum, but they both might mean that a player is, or a person is, struggling. Even to the other end of, you get players that are normally, you know, middle of the road, you know, not really out there in terms of personality, but not withdrawn either, just, you know, cruise around the middle of the group. And then they all of a sudden become the class clown. Whereas for some people, they might recognize that and go, oh, you know, she's finally coming out of a shell type of thing. Whereas I probably look at it and go, something's changed there for that person, because that's out of character. So I don't want to say there's a specific set of behaviors that I would say, oh, you know, that person is probably struggling, because it differs. What I would say is it's about getting to know the people that surround you, or the people that you're working with specifically. So if I know that that's how they usually are, then I will then pick up on behavior patterns that are different or unusual for that player or person. So So yeah, there are your classic signs that we would probably be told about, like withdrawing, change in behavior, anger, outbursts, you know, showing more signs of emotion and stuff like that. But then I have seen cases where it's the complete opposite end. You know, we often see, unfortunately, and unfortunately, I've had a friend that's taken his own life, and I'd seen his Facebook post a couple of weeks leading up to, and I genuinely, even as somebody who works in this, would have never known that anything was wrong. You know, so I don't necessarily think that we always even show signs. I think it's about, and I'm probably digressing a little bit here, but it's sometimes about, is something too good to be true? Is somebody overly happy or showing no signs of, you know, not even saying like, oh yeah, you know, it's been a bit of a crap day, or like we usually do, or oh yeah, living the dream, you know, one of them ones? Are they actually showing signs where you're going, gosh, you know, they look on top of the world at the minute, I actually might want to check in there?
Yeah, that's really interesting how you kind of see that in terms of looking at positive as well as negative behaviors and trying to think about
Yeah.
your role and responsibility via that way. You mentioned around building relationships. Now, speaking to others, there's a bit of a taboo with psychology, and I presume there's a taboo with player care as well. How would you build relationships up with players if you're seen as maybe the person they go to if they're not feeling so great? How do you go about that in terms of your practice?
I think it's about, and again, I'm speaking from sort of a football environment. I think people in our positions and roles need to fully insert themselves in the program. So you don't want to only be having conversations with players or staff that's only about, you know, are you doing okay? What's your well-being? You know, along those lines, where you should be asking other questions. Oh, what did you do at the weekend? What did you have for tea last night, or something? You know, sometimes it's hideously boring, but I think it's really important to have those conversations so that others in the environment pick up on the fact, oh, Abby's actually not just here to speak to us. She shouldn't just speak to us when we have a problem. She's there to just, you know, have a chat to about whatever we want to have a chat about. And that can be really difficult at first. You normally get, I mean, I've obviously just started in, you know, quite recently a new role. And those first 2 weeks are the weirdest period of doing a job, because there's like this middle ground where you're here and the players are over here, and no one wants to step over that line. They'll go, you know, the corridor conversations are, hi, Abby, like quickly scoot off. You know, if I talk to Abby, people might think I've got a problem. But then as you naturally transition into the role and you start showing, you know, having those conversations that aren't necessarily about mental health or well-being, and taking an interest in them as people, not just how are you all the time. So sitting with them, eating their lunch, going out and watching them train, so that they know that you're just kind of in and around the entire environment. You don't just sit in your office upstairs and wait for people to bring problems to you.
In terms of setting that culture, in terms of setting that environment, why is so showing emotional aspects often seen as a weakness within football?
I think, as we touched on briefly earlier, it definitely stems from that hyper masculine nature of the game, I think, and the environment. You know, probably starting over the last 30 years, maybe coming into the 90s, maybe early 2000s, is when football maybe started to change a little bit. So you had the old, you know, what it used to be, like YTS or whatever it was they were on. It was very, you know, oh, well, we'll put you on a BTEC. We don't really care if you pass it or not, but at least we're saying we're giving you something alongside being a footballer. I think times have changed since then. And although it's been gradual, I think we are getting there. But I definitely think that's where it stems from. So I also think, and I'm not blaming men here, I don't want that to be what I'm sounding like, but the hypermasculinity doesn't just come from behavior. It comes from the fact that there's not a lot of female representation or women that work in the game, particularly in men's football. So players don't necessarily always have that, you know, understanding of femininity and you know, I don't even want to say femininity, because I don't think it needs to be, you know, classed as that, but maybe the other side of the spectrum where we're more caring and we, you know, we look after each other and we ask each other how we are, because they've not been exposed to it. So I think that's probably another thing where hopefully, you know, as we've seen more roles come in the environment, and hopefully even from a coaching perspective, I understand why a lot of women don't want to get involved in the game, because it is male dominated, but it's really needed, you know, for even just for players to see a woman coach or to have women in the environment. It just adds a different dynamic. And I don't think actually, and I mean this from all aspects, I don't think football's diverse enough. I don't think football's diverse enough at all. I think we could be much better. I think we're moving in the right direction. I would argue it's probably not quick enough. Unfortunately, that also doesn't mean I have all the answers. I just, you know, acknowledge from being in the game that I don't think we are there.
Have you come across those challenges then, being a female within a male dominated environment? Have you come across maybe some of those factors you mentioned around equality and stigmas and stereotypes, etc.?
I wouldn't say more so as player care. I obviously came from a coaching background. In coaching, absolutely, it was, some of it was, you know, a lot of microaggressions. You know, you're the head coach on the pitch and the ref comes up to say, oh, which you know, what do you want to do with this, what do you want to do with that, and he's talking to my assistant who's a man, because he assumes that he's the head coach, not me. You know, things like that. Oh, what are you doing on you know, this course or whatever? You know, oh well, I've already got, you know, my level 2 and whatever, so I'm doing oh you've already got, you know, find it quite unbelievable that you can share the same spaces. And I've always been quite conscious of that, of really pushing myself out my comfort zone, because it's really easy not to want to go on these courses when you know you're going to be the only woman. But you know, my thought behind that was, well, if I don't do it, then who's going to do it? Somebody needs to pioneer that and start going to these things, otherwise they don't change. I don't think it's been as bad as in player care at all, really. I think people are I've been quite fortunate that the 2 clubs I've worked for have been quite arms open, you know, oh, we need this. You know, we need more women around the environment, and have quite openly said to the staff members, you know, guys, we need more, or have you thought about asking Abby, because it offers a different opinion. So I've probably been quite fortunate in that. And I obviously don't speak for everyone. I think the only thing that I would say that I've crossed in whatever capacity that I've worked in male dominated environments, particularly obviously football, because that's where I've worked most, is probably language and banter. I think you never want to be the killjoy in the room, but sometimes things land differently when a woman's in the room than when if it's all men. And I'm not saying it's right if those jokes are made when only men are in the room, by the way, but I think there's situations where there needs to be a lot more done on awareness around language use and you know, joking and things like that when you're working with different types of people.
It's interesting how you mentioned being in different environments and enrolling on FA level 1, level 2, etc., being the only female. I spoke to Craig Richards, who is head coach of rugby league, and he mentioned his ethnicity, and he would walk into media conferences and people wouldn't recognize him as the head coach of England. There was this typical nature within those environments, and it kind of relates to what you said around gender and how that might impact people's perceptions on who you are and what you can bring and where you should be.
One I normally get, and this isn't actually, I forgot to even mention, this has happened quite recently. Whilst I was still with Forest and we went down to Loughborough, we had it was one of the last games I went to. It was pre-season and the 21s were playing just down there for a game. And I was meeting someone off the pitch, so I was walking off the pitch, and there were some spectators, like just people in and around who just like seen that there was a game on, so was trying to watch who it was and, you know, asking questions. And this guy just straight up goes to me, there's no chit chat, he just goes, oh, are you the physio then? I'm thinking, what a weird way to start a conversation. So I go, no, I'm not. And I thought, do you know what? I'm actually not going to say any more because I don't owe him an explanation of what I'm doing. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And he goes, intern. And I go, no. And again, I was like, I'm just leaving it. I just want to, let that awkwardness sit with you, because I don't owe any explanation to explain to someone who I am and what I do. If you ask me and say, hi, I've seen you work for Forest, what is it that you do for the club? Happy to have a conversation. But there's always that assumption that you do the traditionally female roles. So, you must be physio. You work in the medical department. No. You do, and it's like, no, like, what if I'm a coach, or what if I'm, the academy manager? Might be very unlikely, but that also might be a thing. And as I said, I know that comes out of no malice. It's just because it's what people's stereotypes are. When you see the physios on the telly, then more often than not, there is a female involved. And that's great for women. I'm glad that we're in and around the environment in different capacities, but I just feel we need to just start breaking down those barriers of, you need to do certain things in the game if you're a woman. You can't coach, or you can't do this.
I suppose from your perspective, then success is a feeling rather than a metric. And I think if you compare that to other disciplines, so you mentioned strength and conditioning is very metric driven, and you can kind of track performance. I get the feeling that psychology is messy in some sense, where there's so many strands from different conversations, the different things, and even that example you said then. The example you said then was well-being's perfect, but crowd could impact certain things. There might be emotional factors within the process of playing. Again, there's so many different areas and places to kind of start, and it leads you down a path. I can imagine that is a challenge.
It's dynamic, Christie. So, for example, if you're a strength and conditioning coach and you work on a program with a player, let's say you want to increase their VO2 max because they're struggling with fitness levels. After that 8-week program, you not only have metrics, but let's say that player wakes up the next 3 days and doesn't train, okay? They don't lose anything in terms of performance. It would take a significant amount of time for them to then lose that advantage, because they've, it's a natural component. But well-being changes not even on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. Something in 1 second can completely change your well-being. So all the work we might have done with a player for 3 months may improve performance for 4 weeks, and that player may then have a really, really bad week, and we go back to square one and we have to do all that work again, because it's so dynamic. It's not he's been injured, we put him back up to fitness. There isn't a case where he might become injured again, okay, but we do the same. But he's had an off day today, cool, he's still at the same fitness levels when he comes back next week. It's not, there's no real drop. But for us, it can be, we've done a great job, we've got him to here, and then something catastrophic happens, or sometimes it doesn't even need to be catastrophic, but then we fall off a cliff and we go back to the beginning and we go, that player's struggling again, and we need to put the support in place. So yeah, it comes back to that. It's not as black and white as maybe other disciplines are. It's very grey.
So Abby, people watching this might be within football, they might be within sport, or they might be not in that environment whatsoever, but they might be considering their mental well-being, their mental health, and they might be struggling with different factors such as stress, anxiety, etc. So what things would you consider if someone's going through that process of struggling within those areas? Is there any coping strategies that you are aware of that you apply in practice that might be useful for listeners listening to this podcast?
Yeah, I think my first and foremost piece of advice, which is probably important, is if you are struggling, the first thing is to reach out and have a conversation and get, we sometimes, and I'm quite aware of this, that we use mental health, mental illness, anxiety, stress interchangeably, when actually if people are, if they have actual diagnosed anxiety, then they're going to need different coping mechanisms to someone who's maybe just having an anxious day. So I think that's really important, is to say, we see a lot of, and I love this, we see a lot on social media of like, here's some coping mechanisms, do this, and here's a stress bucket, and all these things flying about self-help, which are fantastic, by the way, for your average Joe who has ebbs and flows, copes quite well but has tough days. Great, put them into your daily, weekly, monthly self-care regime. Whereas for other people who do struggle with actually like struggling to maintain positive mental health, or have actually struggled and been diagnosed with mental illness, that looks very different to them in terms of coping strategies. So I think just make that distinction first. But for me, I think it's all the classics, which probably every practitioner would say, making sure that we are eating the right things, exercising, managing stress in terms of if we need outlets to which I like to call brain dump, so having those talk therapies where we go and we just let it go, we just give it to someone else and go, here you go, that's your problem now, I've let it go. So that helps me, and that's one of my coping strategies. I love to just go offload on someone and go, perfect, I can get rid of that now. But I think all those classic ones, do your exercising, meditation, but I think my key piece of advice to anyone as a human would be just find out what works for you. I've struggled with, as someone who I would like to think is quite self-aware and always has a thirst for learning and knowledge, I tried to do all those things thinking that was going to like maximize my mental well-being, and I was going to be the happiest person alive, because I did meditation, I exercised, I did yoga, I went open water swimming and ate only anything remotely green for the next month or whatever. But actually you really don't need to do all those things. It's finding out what works for you.
Personal awareness of yourself, it's that element of understanding your mental well-being and trying to improve that. It's not necessarily linear. So I always think that people have this perception around improvement, that you go from A to B and it's that journey of just progressing, when in reality there are a lot of obstacles and bumps in the road towards that destination and that end goal.
I had a day like this the other day. I don't know if you saw my LinkedIn post, Christie, but obviously it was World Mental Health Day on Monday. And we'd discussed it, what we're going to do. I was thinking, it's going to be such a good day. We're going to talk to staff, we're going to promote it to players that they need to talk, and all this stuff. And Monday came around and I had an awful day, like truly awful day, start to finish, just all round bang average, did not enjoy it. And I was really disappointed, and I put a lot of blame and I felt a lot of guilt, because I was like, I've not given the best of myself today, which has impacted that whole awareness piece. And then I reflected on it, and this comes into the self-awareness piece, but I actually then thought, that's probably more realistic than you could have been, than you could have wanted to have been, because actually today wasn't about, and I think again this is a social media thing, we get led into believing that awareness days, and they should be positive, but for things like mental health awareness, it's actually more so for the understanding of, it isn't always great. We don't always have great days. Mental health, like you said, isn't linear. We don't just go, I used to be here with my mental health, I'm here now, there's no way I can go back, because that's just not, it's not realistic. But I think that was important to me, and it came back to a conversation I actually had later on in the week last week. I'm the worst person for taking my own advice. When people, obviously that's what I do for a living, I help people manage their well-being, and then when it comes to my own, I just ignore my own advice. So, I'll say to people all the time, and this is probably, a really important thing that comes back to those coping strategies. We're never taught about emotions as kids and growing up. We don't talk about emotions or emotional literacy in schools. And we kind of, if you're not brought up in a home that is open and speaks about emotions and how it is to feel, or it's okay to feel like that, it can be really hard to actually articulate how you do feel. And sometimes what you'll find is people will articulate an emotion and then you'll get them to explain it, and that's actually not that emotion whatsoever. So it happens a lot in football with anxiety. So we frame things as anxiety a lot, and then I'll ask the player actually how they're feeling, and then they'll say things like, "Oh, my tummy hurts," and it feels all funny, and I'm thinking about the game. And then we'll reframe it, and I'll go, "Okay, but are you excited about the game? Like, are you looking forward to the game?" And like they're like, "Oh yeah, and we actually reframe it, and it's excitement and it's nervousness, want to do well, and I'm looking forward to it, I'm excited to play. It's actually not anxiety." So, and we're never taught that. Like, no one really says to us, we only pick up on words and emotions because it's what other people tell us.
Yeah.
Really, as we're growing up, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe people in other schools did have, this is what it means to be happy and this is what sadness is. I definitely didn't. But I think that's really important and this is my biggest piece of advice to people: just feel your emotions. They are there for a reason. And that can be really difficult. And I struggle with that massively. I don't really like being sad. I don't really like being angry. But emotions are there to be felt, and you have to give them that time to just feel. I'm not saying also act on them, by the way. I'm not saying feel angry and go and smash the house up. I'm saying be at peace with the fact that that is how you feel. And unfortunately, you might feel like it for the next 10 minutes. You might feel like it for the next hour. You might feel like it for the next week. But just acknowledge that it's okay to feel, because that's why we have them. If they weren't there for a reason, then we wouldn't have them. they wouldn't happen. So I think it's important to feel, because we can sometimes suppress, and then that becomes more, down the line, that becomes a major problem. And that's where the coping strategies come in: knowing yourself, knowing what you're feeling. So what coping strategies do you need? And yeah, just being able to feel it, really.
So Abby, this leads to your point leads to my final question. Again, just on reflection of what we looked at or what we've talked about today is sociology in terms of your role in the taboo around mental health, etc., and coping strategies from a psychological perspective. If you were to put that together and maybe look forward in terms of your role within player care, where do you see player care developing in the future?
I honestly think player care will grow massively. I think it'll boom. We'll see a boom in it over the next few years. I think we've even seen a boom in the past year. You've gone from probably an average of about 30 player care positions up and down the country to it now being in every Cat 1 to Cat 4 club. So that's grown exponentially over the past year or so. But it's kind of, I always describe this as when sports science came out and we started seeing that breaking through like 90s, and we started seeing Lucozade and, all these things. And now we've got a sports science department of like 6-7 people. I think that will happen with player care. I think organically people will start to see the benefit of it. We'll start to have happier and more positive environments and more comfortable, open spaces where people feel much better about the work they're doing or how they're playing and performing and things like that. So I truly think it will only get bigger. If I'm honest, right now at Swansea, we've just created a department that went from being one person now to 5. So, I mean, that's grown by 5 times essentially in the past year. So I think that we'll start to see that a little bit more. It won't just be one person, it'll then become departments. Hopefully we'll then see progression in CPD courses, universities doing it as a pathway to get into elite sport, whatever sport that may be, and we'll start seeing it progress that way. And I think it will become the next big thing, looking at elite environments and performance, because we know that it does translate onto the pitch and it does help players with performance. Maybe we can't measure it, but we will see the impact. People will start to pick up on that, and it'll be maybe possibly the area where clubs next look for marginal gains. That's what happened with sports science.
Yeah.
What even the tiniest improvements can we do on a daily basis to help team performance? And I truly think player care can offer so much in that department. And also, I think we need to look at the bigger picture. Players eventually leave sport, or sports people eventually leave sport. Usually, apart from a select few sports, the longevity of being in it is actually very, very short. So we need to also look at the benefits of player care of what we do for the person. So we're not only measuring the impact of, oh, they went on, they had an excellent career. Let's look what they did after the career. How successful was that? You know, they've gone on to do this, they started their own business, they set up a consultancy, they've done all this charity work, they've, you know, fathered 15 children, you know, whatever it may be, because success is not defined by one person, but have they gone on to live fulfilling lives? And for me, like, that's definitely a measure of success when I look at what we do. I don't ever want to just develop good players. I want to create great people. I want players to, as I said earlier, when they eventually inevitably leave the club, whatever they go on to do next, whether it's play for another team, become a coach, go to another club and do whatever else, become a teacher, whatever it may be, I want people to come back to me and go, wow, you know, what a good job you did with so-and-so. They had such a great career and then they've gone on to do this, you know, what a fantastic, you know, transition for them. That's my goal. At the end of the day, if they end up playing for the first team, fantastic. That's obviously an objective for us as a whole team of staff that work for an academy. But a measure of success for me is how successful and how fulfilling is the life that they leave when they leave here. That's a huge, you know, success factor for me, and it's definitely something that I would measure my success as a department against. How, you know, great a person becomes because of their time spent with our department and us trying to develop them from a personal perspective, not only as a player. So yeah.
Abby, thank you for joining me on this episode.
Not a problem. Thank you, Chrissy. It's been really, really good.
Where can we find you if anyone's listening and they want to maybe reach out, or some of the things that you mentioned today, they might want to get some more information, etc. We mentioned community of practice. There might be people in positions across the football pyramid that might want to reach out to you. Where can we get you?
Yeah, I'm quite big on stuff like that. So LinkedIn, probably the best way to get me. I try and answer my messages once a week. I try not to be on there all the time, balance and all that. But LinkedIn's probably the best place. I'm also, the only other social media platform I'm on is Twitter. So right. You'll find me on there. I do occasionally post stuff, but to be honest, it's more just for me to be nosy on there. So if you actually want me to reply to you and get in touch, just LinkedIn.
Perfect. Abby, thank you so much once again.
Not a problem. Thanks, Christie. Cheers.